Sanctions and blockades kill like silent atomic bombs. That's what Fidel Castro had to say about the US blockade of Cuba, and it sums up my feelings about my recent trip to Venezuela. Sanctions impact every aspect of Venezuelan life, and in my short trip, I saw how sanctions against Venezuela were preventing housing construction and preventing children from accessing laptops and tablets. If you want to learn more about that, you can watch my reports from the trip. But the larger point here is that it's more or less impossible to have any kind of discussion about the crisis in Venezuela without understanding the sanctions. So what are sanctions? Well, they're basically punishments imposed on a country to discourage a certain type of behavior. Sanctions usually take the form of economic limitations like blocking imports and exports of certain goods, or preventing target governments from accessing its bank accounts or international payments. Now, this might sound pretty innocent, but that's part of the problem. When a country says they're sanctioning government officials or they're targeting certain individuals with sanctions, it makes it sound like it's only a handful of corrupt elites that are being affected.
Targeted sanctions.
Targeted sanctions.
Targeted sanctions.
The order allows for targeting individuals and companies that trade with North Korea.
But when that sanctioned official is the only guy in the country authorized to make international payments on behalf of the government, or access bank accounts, or sell things on international markets, that means the whole country isn't allowed to access those bank accounts. So sanctions are really collective punishment against entire countries. Venezuela's oil sector was sanctioned by the United States, but this profoundly affected all Venezuelans since 95% of government revenue came from oil sales. This revenue was used for trading with other countries and funding domestic programs, so these sanctions had severe implications on the availability of food, transportation, housing, and medicine. In fact, there's actually a gas shortage in Venezuela, which is mind-boggling considering Venezuela has the largest oil reserves in the world. The sanctions have killed at least 100,000 people, mainly due to Venezuela's inability to trade for medicine and other medical infrastructure. So if you think about it, sanctions might even be more deadly than an atomic bomb. While each atomic bomb dropped on Japan killed tens of thousands of people, the sanctions against Venezuela have killed more. And unlike nuclear weapons, which have been widely condemned and never used since they were initially deployed against Japan, sanctions aren't treated as a weapon of war. They're treated as legitimate tools of diplomacy, and their genocidal nature is concealed by terms like smart sanctions, as if there's anything smart or precise about economically blockading a whole country.
We have heard that 500,000 children have died. I mean, that's more children than died in Hiroshima. And you know, is the price worth it?
I think this is a very hard choice, but we think the price is worth it.
The people of Iran obviously have now had enough. The sanctions are working. The currency is going to nothing. We see signs of young men and women saying, "Give me some food." We saw a sign of a man trying to sell his internal organs for $500 American, probably a fortune in Iran today. This is truly pitiful. These are the kinds of conditions that lead to successful revolution.
The intended purpose of a sanctions policy is quite literally to maximize suffering, to sow anger and discontent against a government targeted for regime change. Now, it would be one thing if the world community came together and formed a broad consensus that the actions of a certain country are unacceptable and voted to punish said country. But that's not what's happening in Venezuela. There was no debate or international consensus on these sanctions. What happened is the US and a few of its allies unilaterally decided to impose sanctions on Venezuela and told the rest of the world that if they ignored the sanctions or if they continued to trade with Venezuela, they would also get sanctioned. Given a choice between trading with the world's largest economy and trading with Venezuela, most countries are going to choose the United States. In effect, the United States is using its large economy to force the whole world into taking a hostile position towards Venezuela. This is why the United Nations distinguishes between sanctions and unilateral coercive measures. Sanctions implies that measures are passed through a democratic UN vote, while unilateral coercive measures describe the unilateral action that countries like the US and Canada are taking against Venezuela. Unilateralism is also the doctrine of the US blockade of Cuba, which is still in effect despite last week's UN vote coming out 184-2 against the blockade. So much for democracy. Other sanctioned countries include Syria, Nicaragua, Iran, Russia, China, North Korea, Zimbabwe, and Palestine. So sanctions really aren't an issue specific to Venezuela. The real issue here is US unilateralism. unilateralism and US imperialism. The US thinks it has the right to dictate how all these countries run themselves, and the widespread use of punitive sanctions represents the shift in US imperial strategy. Whereas after the disastrous genocidal US invasion and occupation of Iraq, it wasn't really a good look for US troops to be seen invading and occupying other countries. Sanctions became the US's new mechanism for waging war and toppling governments because they could strangle the economies of governments it doesn't like while saying they were doing it for humanitarian reasons. And best of all, it doesn't get covered in the media like a shooting war, even though it's just as deadly as one. With 1/3 of the world population living under sanctions, we can't separate these issues by country. We can't say we support those living under Israeli blockade in Gaza, but not the people living under US blockade in Venezuela. We can't say we support the Venezuelans living under blockade and ignore the Cubans who have suffered the same fate for over 60 years. The whole tactic of strangling a country's economy to force regime change is the tactic of imperialism and US supremacy. And all of us living under sanctions or fighting against them have to be united against our common enemy, the warmongering US ruling class.